Okay, so I'm very grateful to be with you tonight. It's been the occasion for provoking my own explorations in relation to how activism has any relationship, at least from my perspective, in relation to being a Buddhist practitioner. I have to warn you, it's very much work in progress. It feels like I've been opening a Pandora's box of all sorts of different areas. And so in preparing to try and speak for half an hour tonight, it's felt like I've been trying to pack for a camping trip, a long camping trip with only about a 20-litre backpack. So there's lots of things that I'm going to leave out. And the next thing I need to apologise for is the title of the talk, rather intriguingly, is called The Buddha as Activist. And I'm rather here under false pretenses because I'm not going to be directly answering this question. I don't have any wonderful revelations from the Pali Canon that the Buddha, for example, demonstrated outside Ajatasattu's palace while he was starving his father to death. So anyway, I hope you don't feel shortchanged by that admission. And the way I've structured what I'm going to share with you tonight is to come up with 5 different areas, 4 related questions. And I'm going to try and make sure that I move on every 5 minutes so I don't overshoot myself. So this is far from the last word. You may well disagree with what I have to say. That's perfectly okay. And you may feel I've left out some really obvious points. But what I do hope is that you'll feel stimulated to start your own explorations. So my comments are simply there to stimulate your reflections rather than being the last word on the topic. So just something of a personal history. And while you're listening to me, just sharing this with you, I just would like you just to be just sensing into whether there's any resonances there for you particularly. Is there some question sparked by hearing what is particularly personal to me that chimes with your own sense of what's important for you? So Buddhism, just a little bit about my background, Buddhism has been my touchstone pretty much through the bulk of my adult life. I got involved in the FWBO in 1980. And I spent 25 years fully engaged, living and working in central institutions of the FWBO and then Triratna. And after stepping back from all of that in 2005, I spent approximately the next 12 years practicing psychotherapy and teaching secular mindfulness in a variety of contexts. And then I decided a couple of years ago to retire, inverted commas, and I started to cast around for what to do next. So let me take you back 18 months or so. It's 31st of October 2018, and I'm asking myself with a degree of shock, what on earth am I doing here, sitting in the road, blocking traffic in Westminster outside the Houses of Parliament? And 15 minutes previously, I joined in declaring myself, along with approximately 1,000 others, to be in rebellion with the UK government. In brief, since then, that time, I've continued to be substantially involved with Extinction Rebellion, and I've been arrested 4 times for my troubles. In fact, I was due in court this Friday, but I was informed this afternoon that the case has been adjourned till September. So I'm still actually very much in the same place as I was 2 years ago. Feeling that I can't stand by and do nothing, which is what prompted me to join in. And of course, in my case, it's all about how our collective way of life has brought us to be suffering what seems to be a very imminent global climate and ecological emergency. And I think from an activist point of view, what the bottom line of this is a sort of gut feeling. It's not okay. And it's trying to find a way to express that. And of course, sometimes that in terms of it not being okay, is very much more in our face. And George Floyd's literal "I can't breathe" as he was being murdered is very much more of a kind of gut-wrenching, it's not okay to be seeing that. Other stuff like the climate and ecological emergency takes a little bit more imagination, especially when you look outside on a beautiful sunless day like today. However, I mean, I think what I'd like to stress is it's an entirely personal act. There's no shoulds here. There's no question of me telling you that you should be doing this or should be doing that. This is something that is felt and heard very much in the depths, something which is essential in the core of our being, that demands that, in my case, I act, or perhaps in your case, that you act. It's an intuition, it's a hunch that as a prompting of conscience is the way that I experienced. And nevertheless, despite my conviction, I do find it easily to fall into helplessness, dithering, and in effect just standing by. It's very easy to get trapped into being attached to outcomes and having a wanting to feel effective, asking the question, what is this really achieving? And perhaps a little bit more significantly from a Buddhist point of view is this a genuine living out of the precepts, in particular the first two precepts? When you're blocking traffic, the obvious thing is you're stopping people going about their lives, you're thwarting another's volition, and you're taking the not given. So, you know, these are alive questions for me. So, we use the term activist and activism, and what do we mean by these terms? The question I'd like you to be just thinking about as I just share some reflections with you is, are there any social movements or activists that speak particularly strongly to you, that you find drawn to finding out more about, or even emulating? And when one starts to look into this, which I've been doing a little bit of research, activists and activism comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and arguably Triratna Buddhist community is an activist movement. There are widely differing connotations and associations. Some of the really obvious ones which people come out with is the Gandhi and the Indian independence movement, Mandela, the anti-apartheid movement, Martin Luther King and John Lewis, who just died a few days ago, the civil rights movement in the 60s, William Wilberforce, abolition of slavery, the Pankhursts in relation to the suffragettes movement, and of course Ambedkar in relation to the Dalit Buddhist movement and the Indian discrimination in the caste system. In fact, when you start to look into these things, there are well over 100 examples on Wikipedia of social movements listed and in all sorts of different sizes and shapes, anything from Esperanto to the cooperative movement. And I've just picked out a few here, which probably says a lot more about my particular concerns than you know, the actual breadth of it. So some of the other really common ones which people get mentioned are the peace movement in the 60s, the anti-nuclear war, CND, Polish solidarity, the LGBTQ movement, Me Too. There's a whole host of different groups under the environmental movement, the World Wildlife Fund, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Earth First, Earth Day, and then much more recently, of course, Fridays for Future, which you've seen quite a bit of in Bristol, Extinction Rebellion, and then, of course, even more recently, Black Lives Matter. So some of these are movements, social movements, and some of them have very obviously forms of activism embedded into them. And again, it's a very wide-ranging topic. Activism, if you look in the dictionary, is defines something like direct, vigorous campaigning to bring about political, economic, social change, often directly emerging from inequality, racial discrimination, and exploitation. And it's all about trying to make changes which are perceived to be for the greater good. And the ways that activism works is that it can vary very, very widely, from building local community pressure, including writing letters to newspapers, for example, or petitioning elected officials, or political campaigning like door knocking, or engaging in phone trees, or perhaps a bit more preferential patronage of one sort or another, like boycotting businesses of one sort or another. And then it strikes, and then there are more demonstrative forms of protesting, which can be legal rallies and street marches, through to the more sort of spicy stuff like illegal obstruction, criminal damage, sit-ins and hunger strikes, of these sorts of kinds of actions. So a whole range of different possibilities, yeah. And then within the movement, there's a historically discernible polarity between those who promote what is called structural movements. There was a man called Saul Alinsky who was very much in the news in the 50s and 60s in the USA. And he was advocating the potency of inevitably slow, incremental growth of community groups, coupled with creating very stable institutional bodies. And these focused as a formidable force on creating local change. They would go for very local issues to try and force change. And an example of this, which you might be able to actually catch up on the BBC, called under the documentary series called Mrs. America, shows the Women's Rights Equal Rights Amendment Act going through a whole variety of different shapes and sizes. There's Phyllis Schlafly on one side, who had created a structure called Stop ERA in the Eagle Forum, and against her was Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm and a number of other well-known feminists of the age. And a lot of their campaigning was built around this sort of structural movement. And on the opposite end of that spectrum is something called the potency of unpredictable disruptive uprisings. And this has been dubbed as mass protest. And the Arab Spring perhaps is a really good example of that. And even the Black Lives Matter suddenly sprung out of nowhere, thousands of people on the streets, just almost overnight, completely unforeseen. And somewhere in between all of that is something called the third way, which is called momentum-driven organizing. And this perhaps came most famous in relation to a Serbian movement called Otpor, who brought Milosevic down, the Serbian dictator down. And Occupy in the 2010 Occupy movement and Extinction Rebellion is supposed to be a way of trying to both set up an organization that is going to take advantage of or even promote these moments of whirlwind that suddenly just appear out of nowhere and large masses of people get going. I'm falling behind already, so I'm going to have to jump onto my next area. So what's all of this got to do with Buddhism? And how could or is being an activist of relevance to your being a Dharma practitioner, if at all? Is that a useful question? So that's what I'd like you to be just having a think about as you listen to me. So arguably the Dharma starts with the observation of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, dis-ease. And that is certainly the case with the bulk of activisms, whether it's on a personal, collective, or ecological level. Dukkha is both a fact of life, and it's also the consequence of reactivity, born out of greed, hatred, and delusion, the craving and attachment and clinging that brings about a great deal of dukkha in our lives. And from an activist point of view, it's just the willingness to look at this and to be aware of these things, or perhaps that's the challenge of a practitioner, is to just have the capacity to really take these things in as we find them, not turn away. And of course, inevitably, as we do so, this is going to affect us emotionally. Firstly, there's the stress response. So it's very common to come across one or another, or a combination of fighting or fleeing or freezing. These are the very common instinctual responses that we have to something that we find frightening or challenging. And there may be other kind of rational, legitimate emotions which can come towards us in relation to dukkha, as we see it in whatever form. We might feel overwhelmed, we might feel upset, we might feel sad, we might even feel angry or helpless or hopeless, as I've said, or we might just simply feel a bit numb, passive. There's a quote which I particularly enjoy in this area called by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 when they were going through the great crisis at that time. And he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So awareness, I think, is again very crucial in the willingness to acknowledge the impact of dukkha as we experience it in the world, and just to turn towards it and to accept it for what it is, and then to explore its significance for us. And there's a quite a well-known Buddhist teacher called Tara Brach who devised a meditation called Rain, which is based around that kind of movement of just bringing something into more awareness and holding it. Then alongside of that, I think from a practitioner's point of view, we have to consider our agency. What are we going to do about it? We can't not do anything about it. I mean, that's that is the basic fact, is that we're acting all the time, we're making choices all the time, even if it's a choice not to any particular way. So this is fundamentally just the basic law of karma and the distinction between skillful and unskillful karma. And it's important to bear in mind that inevitably from those actions that are happening all the time in relation to the way we live, we're also choosing more or less wholesome consequences which flow from those actions. And those consequences can be both near and far-reaching. And I think a relevant quote in relation to this is Greta Thunberg, age 16. I'm sure you've heard of her. She said, "I've learned you're never too small to make a difference." So her act of sitting down with a placard of school strike only just under 2 years ago now outside the Swedish Parliament has made an enormous difference, which she could not have possibly foreseen at the time. Another really important of this is to, I think, in relation to turning towards the dukkha that we experience in the world, is just reflecting on the importance of the metta bhavana and the significance of that. Metta, in its fullest form, is called an immeasurable, and in its fullest sense is unconditional, it's universal, and it's directed to all living beings, all living things, anything that is alive. So metta embraces this world of ours in its sort of rich, multitudinous myriad of forms. And it also celebrates the precious, extraordinary uniqueness of life as we find it on our planet. And of course, in meeting just how stressed and threatened life is, and all the difficulties that we experience in life, compassion naturally arises as a natural human response. So the main point I'd like to share with you about metta is that it is lived out, it is embodied, it is an act. So this is just a little quote from Sangharakshita in a question and answer session. He says, "It's not that you just sit on your meditation mat radiating metta towards the world, but keeping well out of the way of the world. It is that metta enters into your action and expresses itself in terms of non-violent action for the benefit of others." So I think one of the great dangers in relation to this whole process of trying to engage with dukkha and doing something about this is we end up shaming and blaming. Of course, this is one of the worldly winds, one of those pairs, and it involves blatant or implicit finger pointing that perpetuates stories of that separate and divide. It's very much the temptation to fall into an adversarial enemy images of one sort or another that polarize and estrange us. So it's them, and we're the ones who are in the right here, but then they're good or they're bad or they're right or they're wrong. Whatever it is, it's always they're the problem. So this kind of promotes a whole kind of competitive, oppositional, and a sort of winning-losing mentality. And you see this being played out a lot in a political arena, which I think is one of the reasons why so many people do feel very cheesed off with politics. Nevertheless, from the point of view of activism, if you're really trying to have an impact on the world, you're still left with the paradox as a Buddhist of the place of non-violent direct action. There was a great 19th century abolitionist, an ex-slave called Frederick Douglass, who was actually eventually nominated to be a vice president in his day, who said that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. So we're confronted by this problem, and what do we do about power brokers, people who possess power? Well, what are we going to, how are we going to go? One of the things that Sangharakshita said was that the power mode always is subordinated to the love mode. So we're going to use power in any kind of way. We have to really search our hearts for trying to see what is really in the depths of that. Is it really metta that is driving us? And I think there are a number of stories in Mandela's life, for instance, which demonstrate the insistence and the importance of non-violence as being the wellspring of where we come from. Okay, so moving on. So when we're considering the enormity of problems facing humanity today in all their various different guises, how do we respond to Triratna Buddhist community's vision of a new society transforming the old and having the order at its nucleus? So when I first encountered the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, as it was then in 1980, age 25, I was still captivated by my teenage idealism of wanting to change the world. And well, I still am, but what appealed to me in Sangharakshita's presentation of the Buddha's teaching was the insistence that this could only come about through a radical transformation of individuals' hearts. And that if sufficient numbers of us engaged in that project, much like salt, we would influence the direction of world events for the better. So I'd come away from, as it were, whatever enchantment I'd had with politics to discover Buddhism in this particular form. And I very much felt that, yes, the system had to change, as indeed I feel that's very much the case today. But I felt at that time that each of us had to change first. We had to change in the depths of our hearts. And that was going to be a long job, grain by grain, human being by human being. And that I was up for it at that point. And perhaps it is the only way. Perhaps you will feel that that's the only way to go about it. It's a little bit more complex than that. We had each other. We had the community of aspiring individuals. Sangharakshita's teaching very much emphasizes the importance of developing individuality, who were together creating not just a supportive community of fellow aspiring individuals and practitioners, what he called the nucleus of a new society, but also a really supportive, positive environment, which came under the heading of the 3 C's, the community, the centre, and the cooperative. And what he was putting forward was effectively a new society coming into being within the old, and this new society would gradually transform the old. So he gave expression to all of this in a talk that he gave in 1976, or a series of talks in 1976 called Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow. And Subhuti, writing in his first book called Buddhism for Today, said, "The Friends of the Western Buddhist Order is to this extent revolutionary. It wishes to change society, to turn the old society into the new. The new society is at war with the old, a non-violent war whose aim is not to destroy but to transform. The weapons are attraction, example, and criticism." So I think the sort of kind of the core of this particular vision was of communities of Buddhists working together, living together, creating a sort of complete environment and context within which they would gradually, as it were, start to absorb ever greater numbers of people from the old society, and that way it's almost like the old society would be parasitized by the new society, and gradually it would be transformed in that kind of way. I think what this vision to some extent raises is the last area I want to share with you, which is what is our goal as a Dharma practitioner? Where are we trying to get to? And where does activism fit into that? And there is I think it's very much a question of motivation. And there's a story which I just want to share with you, which is taken from the universal perspective of the Mahayana, Parables, Myths and Symbols of the White Lotus Sutra, which I believe Shantigarbha is using as a source for his new book on activism. So maybe you'll get to hear a lot more of that. So Bhante in this talk tells a story about a great famine in which there are two men who are sort of contrasting themselves with each other, and each possesses a great store of grain, enough to feed everybody. There's an old man and a young man, yeah? And the old man posts a notice saying, whoever comes will be given food. And appended to this is a long list of rules and conditions. And when he's asked about these, he says, well, that's how it was in my grandfather's time. Whenever there was a famine, what was good enough for him, it was certainly good enough for me. So who am I to change things? If really people really want food, they'll observe any number of rules in order to get it. And if they won't observe the rules, it means they're just not really hungry enough. So that was the way he dealt with the situation. But by contrast, the young man is so concerned to feed everybody that he carries food all over the town and distributes food to everybody. And in spite of being criticized, he says, it's never mind, it's better that some of the grain should be wasted rather than anybody should starve to death. So when the young man rejects the old man's suggestion that he should just let everybody come to him, he says, well, they're too weak to walk. And the old man says, well, that's too bad. They should have come to you earlier when they were stronger. If they didn't think ahead, well, that's their problem. Why should you bother? If they die, it's not your fault. And then he pinned another notice to the first one, which is said, rules for reading the rules. So, you know, obviously you can read these parables in all sorts of a number of ways, but I think for me, it raises the question, well, why should I care? I can only really look after myself. So how can I really be my brother's keeper? And just want to refer you to a book by David Loy called Eco-Dharma in chapter 2, which I really do recommend reading. He talks about the traditional teachings of Buddhism focusing on creating one's own peace of mind. And consequently, social engagement remains a challenge for many Buddhists precisely because they see or have experienced that those committed to social action often experience fatigue, anger, depression, and of course, most commonly, burnout. So the answer, just to cut to the chase, a very long story, is the Bodhisattva path, which stresses the importance of a double practice, one of an inner practice of meditation, reflection, and so forth, and an outer one of activism. And of course, this very much, you know, is just emphasizing Bhante's point about metta being lived out in the world. And I think what I'd just like to just share with you just briefly before I close is the importance of perhaps spending a bit of time thinking about the metaphors that we use to try and describe to ourselves what it is that we're doing in being Buddhists and where we're trying to get to. So you're studying at the moment, I believe, the path of vision and transformation, which is, of course, very much the Noble Eightfold Path. And it's, you know, a particularly strong metaphor which is used in Buddhism a lot. And it implies, to some extent, a ladder, where a journey of steps. And it particularly lends itself to seeing liberation as the true individual's escape from the world of dukkha. Sometimes it's talked about in that kind. It's very much a sort of me perspective, if one looks at it in that sense. You know, what's going to make me happy? well, I'm going to engage in this journey, this pathway. And all of Triratna's distinctive practices, ethics, meditation, spiritual friendship, community living and working, studying, can be viewed in terms of the path of personal development, of growth, and culminating in a kind of a personal enlightenment or liberation and freedom from all the causes of unhappiness. And even you can say this path promises eventual liberation from death. Attaining the deathless is again another way in which Buddhism sometimes talks about the goal, getting beyond and escaping from the endless samsaric rounds of rebirth. So I think the danger in this kind of metaphor is that it's effectively can be a dualism, where the physical phenomenal world, characterized by sickness, old age, and death, is left behind by going on this transcendental path. And in doing so, of course, compassionate activity or social engagement is important, but it's just of instrumental value. It's a contributory cause, supporting a crucially important primary focus on inner meditation, reflective discipline, which in itself actually is best served by being socially disengaged. So you have this kind of, within the metaphor, a kind of sense of trying to leave the world behind, even though one is very much embedded in it. And if we're not careful, we end up, in effect, just deepening our own attachment to an illusory self. So we end up working towards my enlightenment, my liberation, and focusing on my suffering. So, just by way of concluding, I think it's important just to sort of bear in mind what is one of the fundamental principles of Buddhism, which is that is of the interdependence of living beings and systems, and that we inevitably have all sorts of ways in which we affect each other, which are very hard to pin down in any predictable sense. And it's important to have that kind of metaphor as well, which is to sort of balance out some of the limitations of the other ways in which we go about describing to ourselves what it is that we're doing. So just to conclude, what I'm going to suggest that we do in our breakout groups for the rest of the evening is just look at 4 questions, which I'll just share with you again, and I'll put them in the chat, which is, are there any resonances for you in my own story that, for you personally, that spark for you, which are in you? Are there any social movements or activists that speak particularly strongly to you that you feel drawn to finding out more about? And what do you think that any of this has got to do with your Buddhist practice, and particularly your goal as a Dharma practitioner? And then lastly, when we consider how to meet to the enormity of the problems facing humanity today, how do you respond personally to the Triratna Buddhist community's vision of a new society, transforming the old, with the order at its nucleus? So thank you for giving me your attention, and look forward to hearing anything you might like to share with me afterwards. Yeah.